Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. In this week's Casual Friday, I have an update on my 17th century reproduction stockings of Gunnister Man and 5 more breeds from my handspun handknit breed study. So let's get started. I often mention that I don't really care for knitting sweaters in fingering weight yarn because I hardly ever have a chance to wear sweaters of that weight here in Minnesota. I wear worsted weight and bulky weight sweaters all winter, and then there's maybe a week or two where I can wear a fingering weight sweater before it's time to shift to summer clothes. Because we don't have spring in Minnesota. We have April, which is the month where we transition from winter to summer. And that transition is never linear. We can have some really lovely warm days followed by another snowstorm. It'll be raining one day, sunny the next, snowy, windy. You just can't predict it. It's April. Once the snow is actually gone and the ice is off the lakes, usually in the mid to late April, we're left with leafless trees, brown lawns, and piles of salty road sand on the grassy strips between the road and the sidewalk. So this year, on April 1st, we got a snowstorm that brought 9 or 10 inches maybe of heavy snow. And by heavy, I mean wet and heavy. It just completely bent the branches of the trees that flank our front door, just completely bent them to the ground and broke the branches, so many branches of one of the trees that it's half gone now. We had to cut half the branches off. Last week for Casual Friday, I was wearing the sweater I'm showing you on the screen here, which is a very long cardigan. It's heavily cabled. It has a collar on it, very appropriate for the weather at the time. The next day was glorious. We hit 65 degrees and we ate lunch outside in the sunshine of my sister-in-law's patio, surrounded still by snow, but otherwise it was beautiful. Well, you'll notice today I am wearing a t-shirt. So let me stand up so you can see it. It's a sheep who is knitting a sweater. I have no idea where I bought this. It was years ago. But I'm wearing a t-shirt this week instead of a sweater because it's been 80 to 85 degrees every day, which is about 30 degrees Celsius. Sunday will be snow and rain again, and next week will be rainy and in the 50s, which is in the low teens Celsius. So maybe next week I can wear one of those fingering weight sweaters that I have in my closet. Maybe. It does look like it's time to start planning a new linen summer top. So I did buy some linen yarn last month and in the hopes that sometime spring and summer would be coming, and it does look like it's on the horizon now. So I'm thinking about what I'm going to be knitting for to make myself something for the summer. Last week I was showing you the progress I had made on the latest stocking in my project to understand the evolution of knitted stockings. I've knit some from the Tudor era like 1500s, and this one is from the late 1600s. It's a replica of the stockings found on a body dug up from a Shetland Island peat bog back in the 1950s. He's known as Gunnister Man because he was found near Gunnister on Shetland Island. So I found out about this a few months ago from a podcast that Interweave puts out. I will link to that down in the show notes because it's fascinating. It's estimated that the man died right around 1700 just based on his clothing and some coins that were found in his pockets. So I am knitting my stockings, the replicas, using the written description of the stockings that were published in, I believe it was 1955. I think it was found in 51, and then they published the description in the mid-1950s. I'll leave a link down below to that publication that describes all of this clothing and the personal items that were found on him. Now, every time I start a project, I create a spreadsheet. that tracks, my stitch counts and the shaping instructions, maybe when I need to switch to a different needle size or different stitch pattern or whatever, different color. So it's basically a line by line duplicate of the pattern. So if I'm using a published pattern, I'll just transcribe that information into the spreadsheet. I'll calculate, how many stitches I should be having on any given row if there's decreases or increases, that sort of thing. And I do this because I just like to know how far along I am in a project. And because I like to track my projects in 5 percentage point increments in my Ravelry notebook, and I want to know that I'm being accurate, because as things change shape, it's hard to tell like how far along you actually are. But for this stocking, I had to create my own instructions from the written description of the stocking. So if the information said there were 14 decreased pairs over the course of 4 3/4 inches, I had to calculate how often I would need to do those decreases based on my row gauge. Now, how many rows are there in 4 3/4 inches, and so how often would I need to do those decreases? So there's quite a lot of shaping for this stocking because it starts up at the thigh, it indents in at the back of the knee, comes out for the calf, goes back in for down to go down to the ankle. And I was nearly finished with the leg when I realized I had made a mistake in my calculations for the calf decreases. I had misread how long the entire leg was. And so when I woke up on Wednesday morning and I was getting ready to start knitting, I saw my mistake and I had to rip back 5,000 stitches. And I know it was 5,000 stitches because my spreadsheet told me so. Now, I react to this kind of setback very differently if it happens early in the project than when it happens much later in the project. So if I found out at the beginning of the project that I had to rip back all 5,000 stitches that I'd knit, I would have taken what I had off the needles, put it to the side, and then I would have gotten a new ball of yarn and I would have cast on anew. And it wouldn't be until I'd gotten past where I was in the original stocking that I would just, take that one apart. Or maybe when I needed a new ball of yarn, I would start knitting from the old one and kind of rip out stitches as I was adding new stitches. I do that sometimes. But in this case, I was about almost 19,000 stitches into the stocking when I discovered my mistake. So I had plenty, still more remaining that was staying as it was than the amount that I had to rip back. So it's just all part of knitting, and how I react to it really just depends on the particular situation. But it just kind of, was an irritation. It wasn't like soul crushing for me. So I want to go to the overhead and show you a bit more about of the stocking in progress, and show you some drawings of the shaping and how they correlate with the instructions. So this is where I am so far on the Gunnister stocking. This is what's left after having ripped out 5,000 stitches. On Wednesday morning, I realized that the decrease rate I had calculated for the leg was slightly off, and I had started what are called the clocks a little too soon. So the pattern that I'm using is just a description of these stockings. Let me just show you what I mean. So in the description, there are 7 rounds of garter stitch, which mean there are 4 ridges that you can see on the right side of the work. And then they say to begin working the back panel while you're working in stockinette, and you work for 2 inches straight. So this is what the back panel looks like. It is essentially 2 columns of what they call moss stitch. I would call it seed stitch. There's a column of knits that remain plain. Then there's 2 stitches of seed stitch or moss stitch, whichever you want to call it. and then you've got two columns of knit stitches, and then some more seed stitch, and then another column of knits. And so you are working these completely straight, but when you start working the shaping, that knit column is maintained and the decreases are worked on either side. Now I am working an SSK here and a knit two together there. They more than likely would have had a knit two together on both sides. And later on, I was able to look at a fairly up close photograph, and I could see for sure that it was a knit two together on this side, but couldn't see on this side. So they probably had both of the decreases leaning this way rather than one leaning, in opposite directions. And I've got them leaned in this way. They just called them decreases. And they mentioned that when these decreases were being worked, that there were 14 on each side, and all of them were right next to that column of knits except one pair that were not. And they didn't say where they were. They didn't say if they were in between, two specific ones so that there was a longer gap near here, or if they were just stuck in. Just not clear. They have you establish the panel. You're knitting 2 inches straight. And then you're working these 14 decreases on either side of the panel over the course of 4 3/4 inches. And then you switch to increases. So this is the back of the knee. So then you switch to 13 pairs of increases over 4 inches. Then you go straight for 3/4 inch. And then over the course of the next 7.5 inches, you work 13 decreases. And so I, was adding all of this up. This was 19 inches right here, plus the garter stitch was about 1/2 inch. Then they also talk about these clocks that are at the ankle. So it's a stitch pattern, a decorative stitch pattern at the ankle. They don't explain exactly where it's placed in terms of symmetry because you're still working decreases. So they just explain what these look like, but they don't explain exactly where they're positioned or at what point relative to like the decreases or anything. They don't share any of that. You do get the gauge, 7.5 stitches per inch and 10 rows per inch. I'm getting 7.5 stitches and 11 rows per inch. So even if they had told me the exact decrease rate, I would have had to change it in order to make those decreases all occur over 7.5 inches. So when I was planning all of this out, I was planning for the clock to end at that kind of 19.5 inch length. But I didn't realize they indicated that the entire stocking was 23.5 inches or something like that from the top to what they call the bottom of the heel or under the heel or something like that. And so I realized that there was actually a straight portion right here. So these decreases occur over 7.5 inches, but then there is a straight portion in order to get that total length before the heel is worked. And that was what I'd messed up. So I had started the clocks. I had to rip back up to here. I needed to change my decrease rate, and then when I was starting the clocks, there was just a whole bunch of stuff. So I had to rip back all the way up to here. So I'll be starting the clocks. I'm at the point now where I'm about to start the clocks, so that's good news. Somebody is going to ask in the comments what I'm using here to do this. This is a program called, I think it's called Goodnotes. Goodnotes is a program where you can keep books. So you can keep documents, you can keep books. And I think they give you 3 books for the free version. And if you pay, I don't know, it's a small amount of money, and then you can have unlimited books. So I can do things like I can download my digitized copy of Piecework, and I can read it on, this is an iPad Pro, and I have an Apple Pencil. I can have calendars in here. I can have, different patterns, and I can create things. So I have this book where I have things where I sketch things out. It's just a nice program for doing that, because if I want to, draw something and I'm not doing a very straight line, if I just hold it for a while, it'll go straight. And I can use this grid paper. You can choose different kinds of paper, but I can use this grid paper, and say it's 1 inch per square, and that helps me draw something that's proportional as I'm planning it out like this. For drawing schematics, for patterns, I find this to be really helpful. So my next challenge is going to be planning the foot of the stocking. The soles of Gunnister Man Stockings had been replaced, and not replaced by somebody else, but replaced by him. So I'll put a picture on the screen so you can kind of see what the feet of those stockings look like. For one of the stockings, he had taken the leg of a different stocking. So this one has a foot on it, but and this would have been pretty common, is that the legs of stockings didn't wear out. It was the feet that wore out. So sometimes the way that they would replace a foot would be to just take the leg of another stocking that was even older and just use that to create a new foot. What he did was he folded it in half. So there's essentially 4 layers. And that's what he used for the sole of one of his socks. And he just roughly sewed that onto the surviving instep of that stocking. And then on the other stocking, he used what is a woven fabric called rep fabric that I believe is similar to what grosgrain ribbon is like, so that you have it looks kind of like corduroy in a way. The weft threads are bigger than the warp threads, so you get these kind of rows of obvious weaving. I think that's what rep fabric is, my understanding. But if I'm wrong, you can let me know down in the comments, because I really don't know much about weaving at all. The heel is missing. I think there's part of the heel is there, but most of the heel is missing. And so I will be knitting a heel that would have been common at the time. Today it's called the shaped common heel. It's the same one that was used in the Norwegian sock that I reverse engineered a few months back, but I won't be using that technique at the bottom of the heel that I used in that Norwegian heel. That was kind of unique to that part of Europe much later. From what I understand, I'll be using a different technique to close that heel. What I don't know yet is how I'm going to work the toe. The stockings that I knit from the 16th century each had a different type of toe than the other, and I'm not sure how toes might have evolved by the end of the 16th or end of the 17th century. So I'm going to need to do a little more research. I have a couple of ideas about toes that I could use, but I'm not sure what would have actually been era appropriate. If any of you know something about 17th century stockings and might have an idea, please leave those down in the comments. I do have, museum photos that I can look at that I hope are from the same era. One of the things that's tricky is that these were stockings for a common person, not fancy silk stockings that were for a rich person. And so sometimes the techniques might be a little bit different in one type of stocking versus the other. The gauges are very different. The materials are very different. The amount of money they could afford to pay the labor was very different. So that, and I have some time before I get to the toe to figure that part out. But that's the one thing that I'm really not sure what I'm going to do with this particular stocking. So this is the 5th week of my 30 breed handspun breed study. I've been showing you 5 of the breeds each week as I've been knitting up the handspun yarns. So I spun the wools a year and a half ago, and then I waited a year before I started knitting them up. Wasn't sure what I wanted to do with them. So I'm going to go to the overhead. I want to show you the book that I was using as I was spinning to sort of figure out what my approach was going to be to spin those wools. But I want to show you another book that I just came across yesterday as well. So I have this book, Fleece and Fiber Source Book, that it was written by Deborah Robson and Charollais. And I bought this, I think, when I first learned to spin. And it's a really great reference for showing different sheep breeds, describes how coarse or fine it is, things like the fleece weight, the staple length, fiber diameters, how they would recommend spinning with it, examples of yarn that they've spun with it, along with some weaving and a little bit of knitting usually. This one just seems to be showing weaving. And you can just see, what the sheep look like. I really like this. The one problem with this, it's not really a problem, but for looking things up, you see on the sides here, they have, this says Northern European short-tailed families. So they have things grouped in this book by families. This is Welsh Hill and Mountain family. So they have these Merino family, Feral group, English Longwool family. So in order to find a specific breed, like if you don't know what it is, you can't, it's not in alphabetical order. You have to look it up in the index. So yesterday, the Weavers Guild, which is where I learned to spin, they do spinning, weaving, and dyeing. They moved to a new location earlier in the year, and they were having their open house. And so I wanted to see the new space. And when I was looking around, they have a shop. The Weavers Guild is very different than our Knitters Guild. They're really focused on education. They offer all kinds of classes. They don't have like a monthly program for the entire guild like we do for our Knitters Guild. They have special interest groups that might meet once a month, like there's spinners groups, there's weavers groups, all that kind of thing. So when I was looking in the shop, I saw this, and at first I thought it was just a paperback version of that. And then I'm like, oh no, this is different. I'd heard of this, but I'd never seen it in person. So this one has more than 200 fibers from animals. So it's not just sheep. And this one is sheep breeds, and it's 100 sheep breeds and how to use their fibers. And this is in alphabetical order. So this is the kind of thing I could take to like a fiber festival. I could just put it in my bag. And if I saw something I'd never heard of or was wondering about, I could look it up in here, and it would give me a lot of the same kind of information that the Fleece and Fiber source book would give, but it would just more succinct. And so that I thought was really great, because I had heard of this a long time ago, but I really didn't understand what the difference was between this and the other one. It just wasn't clocking that it was two different things for some reason. So this week, I'm going to show you the Southdown Welsh, Charollais, Zwartbles, and the Targhee. So this first one is Southdown. So this is a really old sheep breed. It was one of the first breeds that was imported here to the US, like in the late 1700s, maybe very early 1800s. So this is what you'd see on a farm. It'd be very typical to see on a farm in the US in the early 19th century. So we have a farm here in Minnesota that is owned by our historical society. It's called I think it's called the R. Kelly Farm, something like that. It was owned by somebody who was here very early in our state's history. He formed the State Agricultural Society, which also runs the state fair, which knitters in Minnesota love, because we have a huge knitting competition at our fair. So his farm is set up so that you can see what a farm from the 19th century looked like, and that includes the kind of sheep. And they have fleece on their face and on their legs. So some sheep do not have any fleece on their face or legs, and others do. And it tends to overgrow into their eyes, and so they can't see very well. But one of the advantages of this characteristic in the Civil War, when wool was in high demand, was that you got a few extra ounces of wool from it. So apparently that wasn't one of the original breed characteristics, and the farm is trying to breed that out of them, not having much luck with that. So the way I knit this was a little bit looser than I should have. When I was calculating my wraps per inch, I got the correct wraps per inch, but I interpreted that incorrectly as being a bulky weight instead of a worsted weight. So I should have knit this on smaller needles. So it's kind of an open knit, which is okay for the purpose I'm going to use all these squares for. One of the things that I see in my notes is that I used the comb top that was sent to me. It's all lined up in combed top, but I, for whatever reason, decided to try spinning it using the long draw method, which is a woolen spun method. It was a short staple length of the fiber, and I thought, I'm just going to try this. And as a result, my knitting, the yarn was kind of uneven. So if I were to do this over again, I would either card it properly and then try long draw, or I would do a worsted, a short draw method. So there's just a few things that went wrong with this Southdown yarn as well as the swatch. So these are small little sheep. They're not very big, and apparently they use them in vineyards in New Zealand and in California to kind of graze on the weeds in the vineyards, but they're too short to be able to reach the grapes, so they don't destroy the harvest at all. So I thought that was kind of an interesting thing. So I would like to try spinning again with Southdown and just do a better job of that whole process. This is probably the one real dud I have in my entire breed study. So this is the darkest of all of my swatches. This is just labeled, it was just labeled as Welsh. So I believe it's Black Welsh Mountain is the breed. There's just Welsh Mountain, which is a white sheep, and then there's the Black Welsh Mountain sheep. I really like this. I like colored wools, and this is just so dark. Of course, you know, the darker the yarn, the harder it is to see what you're doing. But it's just a really nice wool to knit with, and it's like one of those ones I'm like, this is a real wool. It would probably be too scratchy to wear against your bare skin, but it just seems really nice. And I feel like I got an even spin on the yarn. I like my knitting. There's a little bit of texture in it because it's hand spun, but it's not super obvious. So I really like this. And of course, the challenge with really dark wools, you know, even if you're doing texture, which is what I like, it's going to be hard to see that texture because it's so dark. So this might be something that would be really, it would be interesting to knit a project that had the white Welsh Mountain sheep and then the black, and combine those two things in a project. That would be interesting. But I'd certainly like to spin and knit with this breed again. So this one is Charollais. And there's a little bit of red in here, red fibers. My carpet in my office is red, and it spits fibers all the time. And I had all of the skeins of yarn on the floor numerous times to photograph or to think about whatever. And I think it picked up some, and I just didn't notice when I was knitting. So this one, I carded the wool. I didn't just try spinning right from the combed top. I carded it and then I spun it long draw. So I did a true woolen preparation for this. And the yarn came out better than the Southdown one because of that. So this is an interesting wool. This is, again, another one that I would just call, you know, this is a wool. It's not, you know, something I'd make a delicate items with. I wouldn't wear it against my skin, but it was certainly nice enough to spin with and to knit with. I just need to avoid red carpet fibers. So this is another black sheep, but it isn't as dark as the Black Welsh Mountain. Let me put these next to each other. You can see the difference in how dark those are. You know, this is the darkest, and then we get this one. And the other two, I think the Jacob was probably closer to the Zwartbles, and then the Max Lochtan was another one that was brown, and that was a very kind of light brown, kind of milk chocolatey color. So the Zwartbles was very interesting for me to knit for a couple of reasons. Back in 2018, a couple of months before I decided to learn to spin, I decided I wanted to try knitting with other breeds of yarns made from other breeds of wool than what I was used to, because I would just go into a yarn shop, I'd get some basic wool, and it was usually Peruvian Highland wool, sometimes merino. You know, some places will sell a little BFL, blue-faced Leicester, or some Shetland, but you know, there's really the same kind of handful of breeds. And I usually, you know, was looking for a solid color wool in the right yarn weight and the right color, and I hadn't really cared about breeds. So I started following an Irish shepherd who has a farm called Zwartbles, Ireland. And these little sheep are so cute. They're black, and they had a white blaze down the nose, and they had white socks and a little white tip of the tail. They were really cute. It was lambing season, and I thought, I want I should buy yarn from her because, you know, that's a wool I've never heard of and certainly can't get in just any yarn shop. And so I ordered some from her and I got it. And my idea was I was going to make an Aran sweater from this yarn that I got from the Irish Shepherd. And so I got it and I started swatching with it and I thought this is so, and I was trying to do, you know, cables in my swatches and I was really struggling. The wool was really quite sticky. It just wasn't behaving the way I was used to. And I didn't know if it was, I didn't know why. I thought maybe it was because it was the breed of sheep, because that was the only thing I knew that was different about this yarn. So then a couple of months later, when I decided to learn to spin and I started spinning, I started learning about things like the direction of the twist in the singles and in the plies. I started learning about woolen preparation, you know, carding something versus a worsted preparation, which is combed fiber. I started learning about the different ways that you could actually spin. You could do a worsted technique for spinning or a woolen technique for spinning, and then it's the whole spectrum, and so you could have this whole spectrum of wool preparations as well as a spectrum of spinning techniques to create yarns that were very specific. And later that year I got back to working on the Aran sweater, and this is a leftover of that yarn that I bought because I did end up making a sweater from this yarn, but when I returned to it, I understood more about this yarn. What I understood was that this was a carded wool. It had not been combed, and it was spun on a spinning mule, which does spin woolen. It does make woolen spun yarns. And the wool the singles were spun with an S twist, and they were plied Z. So if I get my hands out of here, let me zoom in a little bit more so that you can just see just the yarn. So if you look at the wool here, you can see that the way that these twists are going are in this direction to the right. So that shows that it is a Z plied yarn. So I was struggling with the yarn for a couple of reasons. One was that it was woolen spun, so it was stickier than what I was used to, so I couldn't knit as tightly. Especially with cables, which is what I'm used to doing, is working to a firm gauge when I'm going to do something heavily cabled, like firmer, like using a smaller needle than I would if I was going to knit plain stockinette, so that the sweater would hold up under the bulk. And eventually what I realized is I didn't need to knit to that firmer gauge because the woolen spun is going to hold itself up. So I typically need to knit a lot with a larger needle and with a little bit larger gauge with a woolen spun yarn than with a worsted spun yarn, because a smooth worsted spun yarn is usually what I use for cables. You get really good stitch definition. Maybe not as good stitch definition with a woolen spun. There's just, you know, differences and there's trade-offs. So the other thing about a Z plied yarn is that as you are knitting and you're bringing the yarn around the needle, if you are knitting in the standard Western way, so that the yarn is going around the needle counterclockwise, so you're not an Eastern knitter or a combined knitter, as you knit, the Z plied yarn is going to untwist a little bit. So that was another thing. It was like, why is this yarn unplying? So these are just things I had to get used to. And so those qualities had to do with how this wool was prepared and how it was spun. It has nothing to do with the breed. So if we look at the yarn that I spun myself, let's see if we can see in here. Can you see how the twist on the ply on this one is going in this direction? So that is an S ply. So I used comb top, which is a worsted preparation. I used a short draw method of spinning, which is a worsted method of spinning, and it has this final S-ply. So this was very smooth and easy to knit. It was very different from knitting this one. So that doesn't mean that this is a worse yarn than this one. It's just that they have different qualities. And what it showed me is that the qualities that this yarn had didn't have that I was struggling with had nothing to do with the breed. It had to do with how the wool is prepared and how it was spun. So that has been a really educational thing for me. to come kind of full circle to, you know, the wool that I started with, and in trying to understand other wool breeds before I was a spinner, and then what I was able to create as a spinner several years later. So I really liked this. I love this, the way it feels. It's like, again, a real wool. I think historically these sheep came from the northern part of the Netherlands in Friesland, and they were used mostly for milk production and meat. But now, and then they were becoming a rare breed by the 70s, and so they were imported to the UK, and they were developing the breed there, and then also obviously into Ireland. There's some there, and they use them for meat, but also for the wool as well. So this last one is Targhee. And this is an American breed. It was developed out in the West. That's where most of the large sheep herds are here in the U.S. And it was developed by the USDA. So that's the United States Department of Agriculture, their Agricultural Research Service. So they developed Targhee, I don't know when, I'm not sure how many decades ago. It is a combination of Rambouillet, which is French Merino, Corriedale, which is a New Zealand breed that started with Merino and crossbred with Lincoln, which is a long wool breed. So they took a soft breed and then combined it with a long breed. So they took these two breeds that were already based on Merinos plus some long wool, and then they crossed it again with Lincoln, which is the long wool, and you get Targhee. So it's very smooth. It's not hairy at all. It's very soft. You know, you can feel the merino in it because it's soft. It's not that super, super soft. It just feels like a really nice wool. You probably could wear it against your skin. It's just really nice, and it's, you know, very springy. It's just got all those, the springiness of merino and the strength of the Lincoln, but it's just, you know, this combination of different breeds. So this is a true American breed, but is based on a merino, which originally came from Spain. It went to France. It was developed there, ported to the U.S., you know, and then the Corriedale, which, you know, was developed there and then brought to the U.S. So all of these interminglings created the Targhee. And I really like this a lot. I would definitely spin this again and definitely knit this again. I like the knitted fabric. A lot of times with hand spun, things tend to look kind of uneven, and I don't like that. But this is even enough that the little bit of variation in the texture doesn't bug me the way it does in some of the other yarns that I have spun. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.